My name is Frank Delaney. I'm 71 years old. And 3 weeks ago, at my own son's promotion party, his mother-in-law looked me up and down in my only good suit and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Is the janitor lost? The party's for family." Nobody laughed, but nobody corrected her either. My son, Michael, the one being promoted to lieutenant colonel that night, just stared at his shoes. What none of them knew is that 34 years ago, in a compound outside Kandahar, I taught the man now shaking Michael's hand, his commanding officer, General Robert Hale, how to stay alive when the world was trying very hard to kill him. This is the story of how one dinner reminded me why I never needed anyone's respect to know who I am. But it's also the story of how sometimes the truth finds its own way home, whether you go looking for it or not. I need you to understand something before I go further. I never wore my service like a badge. I didn't correct people. I didn't drop hints. When my daughter-in-law's family asked what I used to do, I just said I was in the Army for a while. Then I drove trucks for 20 years after that. Both true. Neither the whole truth. I raised Michael alone after his mother passed when he was 9. Pancreatic cancer, fast and merciless. I still remember the hospital room, the smell of it, the particular gray light that comes through hospital blinds in the late afternoon. Eleanor held my hand until she couldn't hold anything anymore. And then I walked out into a parking lot with a 9-year-old boy and no idea how either of us was going to keep breathing. I drove long-haul freight to keep the house because a disability pension from an injury I don't talk about wasn't enough on its own, and I wasn't going to raise my son in a shelter. 2 weeks on the road, 4 days home. That was the rhythm of Michael's childhood for a long stretch of years. I missed birthdays. I missed a Christmas or two. I remember calling him from a truck stop in Amarillo on December 25th, listening to him try to sound like it was fine, both of us knowing it wasn't. But I never missed the important thing. I was there when it mattered, and Michael became a man I was proud of in a way that had nothing to do with medals. There's a memory I keep coming back to. Michael was maybe 11. And some kid at school had said something about him not having a mother, the way kids do when they haven't learned yet how much words can cost. He came home swinging his backpack at the wall, furious in that specific way. Only children who don't yet have words for grief can be furious. I sat with him on the porch for 2 hours that evening. I didn't have wisdom to offer him. I just sat there, and eventually he leaned into my side, and we watched the streetlights come on one by one down the block. I think about that porch a lot. It's a small thing. Nobody gives you a medal for sitting on a porch. But I'd trade every ribbon I ever earned for the fact that my son leaned into my side that night instead of away from it. He joined ROTC in college without telling me until it was done. I remember him bracing for an argument, like I might tell him it was a mistake, that he didn't need to follow in footsteps he barely understood. Instead, I just said, well, I suppose it's in the blood. He didn't know how true that was. I didn't explain further, and he didn't ask. That was how we operated, Michael and I respecting each other's silences. Over the years, Michael rose through the ranks the honest way, deployments, exams, the unglamorous grind of being good at a hard job nobody applauds you for on a daily basis. He married Ashley 4 years ago. Good woman, I always thought. Smart, kind, in the ways that mattered. The quiet ways, the way she'd call me on random Tuesdays just to ask how I was doing, not because Michael told her to, but because she meant it. But her family was a different story entirely. Before I go further into what happened at that party, I want to take you back 30-some years, because you need to understand who Frank Delaney was before he was anybody's handyman or janitor. I enlisted at 19, mostly to get out of a small Ohio town that had nothing left for me after my father's factory closed. I found something in the Army I hadn't expected to find. Not glory, nothing like that. I found a kind of clarity. A job where the rules were clear, the standards were high, and nobody cared what your last name was or what side of the tracks you grew up on. You either did the job right or you didn't, and everybody's life depended on the answer. By my late 20s, I'd found my way into training, teaching young soldiers the skills that separate the ones who come home from the ones who don't. Survival skills. How to control panic when your body wants to scream. How to find a way forward when every instinct says there isn't one. Robert Hale came through my course as a 23-year-old second lieutenant, and I remember him clearly because he was exactly the kind of soldier who worried me, most smart, talented, and just arrogant enough to think smart and talented would be sufficient. I've seen good men die from that particular combination. I rode him hard that summer, made him repeat drills in total darkness until his hands knew what to do without his eyes helping, made him sit with the discomfort of not being in control over and over until his breathing stopped racing every time something went wrong in a simulation. He hated me for about 6 weeks. Then, near the end of the course, he came to find me one evening and said, "I understand now. Thank you, Sergeant." That was all. I didn't need more than that. There's one night from that course I still remember clearly, 34 years later. We'd put the trainees through a long exercise designed to simulate the disorientation of a real crisis. I won't get into the specifics of how, only that it was designed to strip away a young officer's confidence and see what was left underneath once the confidence was gone. Most of the trainees struggled the way you'd expect. Hale didn't struggle. He panicked quietly in a way that was almost worse because he tried to hide it behind competence he didn't actually have yet. I pulled him aside afterward, past midnight, both of us sitting on the tailgate of a truck under more stars than most people ever bother looking up to see. He was furious with himself, the way sharp young men often are when they discover a limit they didn't know they had. I didn't console him. I told him the truth because that was the only thing that was ever going to be useful to him, that everybody has a moment where their training runs out and only their character is left standing. The job wasn't to never reach that moment. The job was to know ahead of time who you were going to be when you got there. He asked me how you know that about yourself before it happens. I told him, you don't, not really. You just build the habits ahead of time that make the answer more likely to be the one you'd be proud of. Breathing, discipline, the refusal to let panic make your decisions for you. I made him repeat the exercise 3 more times that week. Later, quieter, more controlled each time, until something in him settled that hadn't been settled before. He thanked me before he shipped out for his first posting. I told him not to thank me yet. Thank me if the training actually mattered someday, which is a strange thing to say to a 23-year-old, and an even stranger thing to have turned out to be exactly true 11 years later. In a tunnel outside Kandahar, neither of us could have imagined that night on the tailgate of a truck. I trained soldiers for 6 years. Some of them I never heard from again. Some of them didn't come home. And I carried each of those names quietly. The way you learn to carry things in that line of work, not forgetting, just learning to keep functioning around the weight of it. There was a young corporal named Danny Wexler who came through my course the same summer as Hale, sharper in some ways, actually quicker on the drills, better instincts under pressure. I remember thinking, if I had to bet on which of these 2 young men would still be standing in 20 years, I might have bet on Danny. He didn't come home from his second deployment. I got a letter from his mother 18 months after the funeral, thanking me for training her son as well as I had, saying the platoon commander told her Danny had never once panicked in the moment that took his life. I've kept that letter in a drawer for over 30 years. I take it out sometimes, not often, just enough to remember that the job I did mattered in both directions for the ones who came home and for the ones who didn't, whose families deserved to know their sons had been prepared as well as any instructor could prepare them. I tell you this not to make the story heavier than it needs to be, but because I want you to understand something about men like me who came home from that kind of work and went quiet about it. It isn't modesty exactly. It's the weight of knowing the job was never really about glory in the first place. Some of us trained soldiers who lived, some of us trained soldiers who didn't. You carry both, and you don't get to pick which memories surface at a country club bar 30 years later when someone calls you a janitor. And some of them, like Robert Hale, went on to build careers. I'd occasionally hear about secondhand, a promotion here, a commendation there, filed away in the back of my mind like old photographs I didn't need to look at often to know were still there. I left the service with an injury I still don't discuss in detail. The specifics don't matter for this story, only that it ended my time in uniform earlier than I'd planned, and it took something from my body that never fully came back. I came home to Ohio, married Eleanor, and started building a different kind of life, a quieter one where nobody called me sergeant, and that suited me fine. I never once, in 34 years, wondered what became of Robert Hale specifically. There were too many names to keep track of that way. I simply trusted that I'd done my job as well as I could and let the rest of it go the way you have to. Ashley's mother, Diane, made it clear from the first dinner that my son had married up. Her husband, Gerald, owned 3 car dealerships across 2 counties. Their house had a wine cellar and a koi pond. Mine had a recliner with a coffee stain shaped like the state of Florida, and I was not ashamed of either. I never resented them for having more. What I resented quietly and only ever to myself was the way Diane looked at me like an expense Michael hadn't properly budgeted for before proposing. The first real needle came at Thanksgiving, the year after the wedding. Diane was showing off a renovated sunroom, walking guests through it like a realtor. And when she got to me, she said, "And Frank here appreciates good craftsmanship, don't you, Frank?" I imagine you've had to do quite a bit of your own home repairs over the years. It sounded like a compliment. It wasn't. It was a way of reminding the room, gently and publicly, that I was a man who fixed things because I couldn't afford to pay someone else to. I let it go. I always let it go. The next year, at Ashley's birthday dinner, Diane asked me in front of 8 people over appetizers what my retirement plans looked like. I said I was comfortable, which was true. She pressed further, but comfortable how exactly? Michael mentioned you never really had a corporate pension with the trucking and everything. I understood immediately what she was actually asking. Will you need money from my daughter's household someday? And should I start preparing Michael for that conversation now? I told her I was fine and changed the subject to the dinner rolls. She let it drop, but I noticed she watched me a little differently after that. The way you watch a line item you're keeping an eye on. There was a Christmas 2 years back when Diane introduced me to her book club friends. As Michael's father, he was in the service, I believe, a long time ago, in precisely the tone you'd use to describe a hobby someone had given up, like she once knew a man who used to collect stamps. One of her friends, trying to be polite, asked, "What branch?" Diane answered for me incorrectly before I could open my mouth, and moved the conversation along to something about a cruise. I never corrected her. Partly out of pride, if I'm honest, a stubborn refusal to perform my own worth for people who hadn't bothered to ask a real question, and partly because Michael's happiness mattered more to me than my own comfort. And Michael had built a life with Ashley that made him happy, and I wasn't going to be the reason that got complicated. Ashley, to her credit, saw more than her mother gave her credit for. She pulled me aside once at that same Christmas and said quietly, "I'm sorry about my mom. She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." I told her not to worry about it. I meant that too. Mostly. Ashley was one of the good ones, and I never wanted her caught in the middle of something that was really between me and Diane's assumptions. The worst of it came at Ashley and Michael's own wedding, if I'm honest. Though I never told Michael how much it stung at the time, it wasn't his day to spend worrying about my feelings. During the rehearsal dinner, Diane stood to give a toast about the two families coming together and spent nearly 4 minutes describing Gerald's business success, her own charity board positions, and the vacation home in the Outer Banks where the newlyweds would be welcome anytime they needed to get away from things. She mentioned my side of the family for exactly 1 sentence, and of course, Michael's father, who I understand has quite a story of his own, someday, perhaps. Then she moved on to describing the catering. I sat there in my rented tuxedo, the only formal wear I owned at the time, and I thought about Eleanor and how she would have stood up in the middle of that toast and said something Diane would have remembered for the rest of her life. I didn't have Eleanor's fire. I just smiled and clapped when everyone else clapped, and told myself it didn't matter because the wedding wasn't about me. It was about my son and the woman he loved, and I wasn't going to make it about anything else. There was a harder year before all of this, one I don't talk about much, even to Michael. After Eleanor died, there were maybe 8 months where I wasn't entirely certain I was going to make it through in one piece. Not the dramatic kind of not making it, just the slow erosion kind, where a man stops seeing the point of getting up some mornings. What pulled me through wasn't therapy, though I probably should have tried that sooner than I did. It was a 9-year-old boy who needed breakfast made and homework checked and someone to sit with him on the porch. Michael saved my life before he ever knew there was a life that needed saving. I've never told him that directly. Maybe someday I will. But that promotion party was different. That was the night they stopped just tolerating me in private and started performing for an audience. The promotion ceremony itself was beautiful. I watched from the 3rd row as they pinned the new rank on Michael's shoulders, and I'm not ashamed to say I cried. 41 years old, and my boy was a lieutenant colonel. Eleanor would have been so proud she'd have made a scene about it. Honestly, she was never as quiet about pride as I am. The reception afterward was at the Whitfields Country Club, the kind of place where the napkins cost more than my monthly gas bill, and the valet looked at my 12-year-old sedan like it had personally offended him. I wore the one suit I own that doesn't have a hole starting in the elbow. I brought a card with $100 in it, which I knew was nothing to these people and everything to me. I made small talk early in the evening with a retired colonel named Sanders, a friend of Gerald's, who mentioned offhand that he'd heard General Hale rarely attended events below the level of full bird promotions. Big deal he's even here, Sanders said. Must think highly of your son. I agreed and thought nothing more of it at the time. I was standing near the bar, nursing a club soda, when Diane approached with a woman I didn't recognize, silver hair, sharp blazer, the unmistakable bearing of someone used to being saluted. Frank, this is General Hale's wife, Carol. Carol, this is. Diane paused, just a half second too long, scanning me like she was trying to remember my job title. This is Michael's father. Carol extended a polite hand. Before I could speak, Diane added, with a small laugh meant to be charming, Frank helps out around the house sometimes, handyman work, very reliable. I stood there. 40 years of discipline is the only reason my face didn't move. Carol, to her credit, looked confused. Oh, I thought you said Michael's father was... Is the janitor lost? A new voice cut in Diane's sister, Patricia, who'd clearly had 2 glasses of Chardonnay, too many, and thought she was being funny. The party's for family, honey. The catering staff is supposed to stay in the kitchen. There it was, out loud, in front of General Hale's wife, in front of half the room, within earshot. I saw Michael's face from across the room. He'd heard it. He started moving toward us, jaw tight, and I did something I rarely do. I raised a hand slightly, telling him, without words, "Not yet, son, let it be." Ashley had heard it too. I watched her face go pale, then furious, in a way I'd never seen from her before. She started to say something to her aunt, but I caught her eye and gave her the same small shake of the head I'd given Michael. Not yet. Because something in me, some old quiet instinct told me this wasn't a moment to explain myself. It was a moment to let the truth arrive on its own schedule. I'm his father, I said simply to Carol. 41 years now. Best thing I ever did with my life. Carol's eyes softened, but Diane just smiled thinly and steered her away, murmuring something about needing to find the general. I stood alone by the bar for a moment, and I'll admit it stung. Not because I needed Patricia's respect, but because in that moment, I understood something clearly. They didn't just think I was beneath them. They thought I was invisible enough to insult to my face in front of strangers at my own son's proudest night. I finished my club soda. I thought about leaving quietly after the toasts, the way I usually did at these things. No scene, no speeches, just Frank, fading into the background like always, driving home alone to a quiet house with a coffee-stained recliner and no regrets about who I was, whatever anyone in that room thought of me. Then General Hale asked to say a few words. General Robert Hale was not a large man, but he filled a room the way certain men do, not through volume, but through the stillness other people arrange themselves around. He'd flown in specifically for Michael's ceremony, which everyone kept mentioning like it was a minor miracle. Generals don't usually attend lieutenant colonel promotions personally. He tapped his glass. The room quieted. I don't usually do this for 05 promotions, he said, and a ripple of polite laughter went through the crowd. But Michael Delaney is not a usual officer, and I wanted to say why in front of the people who matter to him. He talked about Michael's service record, efficiency reports, a rescue operation in his second deployment that I'd never heard the details of because Michael never talked about the hard parts. The room listened, impressed, the way rooms do. Then General Hale said something that stopped my heart in my chest. But I'll tell you something most people in this room don't know. The reason Michael is standing here today, the reason I'm standing here today, traces back 34 years to a survival instructor at Fort Bragg who taught a scared, arrogant 23-year-old lieutenant something that saved his life 11 years later in a collapsed tunnel outside Kandahar. He scanned the room slowly. That instructor's name was Frank Delaney. I heard my club soda glass hit the bar top harder than I meant it to. Every head turned. Diane's face went the color of the tablecloth. Patricia's wine glass hovered halfway to her mouth and simply stopped there. Frank, General Hale said, looking directly at me now, I didn't know until 3 days ago when Michael mentioned his father's name during a briefing about family in attendance that you were Michael's dad. I nearly fell out of my chair. 34 years, and I never made the connection. Delaney's not exactly a rare name, but I never forgot the man who taught me how to control my breathing when the tunnel behind me collapsed and I had maybe 40 minutes of air. I never forgot the man who made me practice finding my bearings in complete darkness until my hands could do it without my eyes. Because 11 years after that training, in a hole in the ground outside Kandahar, with my radio dead and my leg pinned under rubble, that training is the only reason I'm alive to give this toast tonight. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. For a moment, standing there with my club soda sweating in my hand, I wasn't in that ballroom at all. I was back on that truck tailgate under the stars at Fort Bragg, 34 years younger, telling a frightened 23-year-old that character shows up when training runs out. I had said those words to dozens of young soldiers over 6 years. I had no way of knowing back then which of those conversations would end up mattering most, or when, or how. You never do. You just keep showing up and doing the work and trusting that some of it lands somewhere it needs to. Master Sergeant Frank Delaney, General Hale continued, spent 6 years training soldiers who went on to serve in some of the most dangerous postings this country has asked young men and women to serve in. He carries a Bronze Star with valor that, as far as I can tell, almost nobody in this room has ever heard about, because he never once mentioned it to me in the 30 seconds we spoke earlier tonight when I shook his hand and had no idea who he was. And tonight, I found out that the same steady hands that taught me to survive also raised the officer we're here to celebrate. He raised his glass toward me. Frank, I don't know what kind of night you're having standing over there by the bar, but I want you to know some of us have been carrying a debt to you for over 3 decades, and we don't forget who taught us how to come home. I wish I could tell you I said something profound. I didn't. I just nodded, throat too tight to trust my voice, and raised my glass back to him. But I watched the room instead. I watched Diane's face cycle through disbelief, humiliation, and a kind of frantic mental math, replaying every dismissive comment she'd made about me over 4 years, wondering how many of them had been overheard by people who mattered to her. I watched Patricia set her wine glass down very quietly and find an urgent reason to visit the restroom. I watched Carol, General Hale's wife, walk directly across the room to me, take both my hands in hers, and say, "I am so sorry for what I heard earlier. That should never have happened to you. Not tonight, not ever." I watched Colonel Sanders, who'd been chatting with me earlier about nothing in particular, straighten up and say, "Master Sergeant Delaney, it's an honor," with a formality that felt like it belonged to a different decade. He told me later, over a second drink neither of us really needed, that he'd served 2 tours with men who'd trained under instructors like me, and that he'd always believed the instructors were the most under-recognized part of the entire military machine. "Everybody remembers the general who gives the speech," he said. "Nobody remembers the sergeant who made sure the general lived long enough to give it." I told him I'd never needed to be remembered. He said that was exactly the problem with men like me, and he meant it as a compliment. A few other guests drifted over in the following minutes, people I'd been introduced to earlier in the evening as Michael's father and nothing more, now suddenly full of questions. What was Fort Bragg like in those years? Had I served overseas myself? Did I know so-and-so, a name I vaguely recognized from 30 years back? I answered what I could, deflected what I couldn't, and mostly just tried to keep my voice steady, because the whole evening had taken on the strange, floating quality of a dream you're not sure you're going to remember correctly in the morning. I noticed, too, the ones who didn't come over. Patricia stayed near the restroom hallway for a long while. A few of Diane's book club friends suddenly found urgent reasons to check their phones. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody stormed out. It was quieter than that, just a slow, uncomfortable recalibration happening in real time across a room full of people who'd spent 4 years deciding I wasn't worth a second thought. And I watched my son. Michael didn't say anything either at first. He just crossed the room, put both arms around me the way he used to when he was small enough for me to lift, and held on for a long moment. I felt his shoulders shaking slightly, and I understood he was crying quietly into my shoulder in front of every officer and country club member in that ballroom, and he didn't care who saw. "You could have told me you knew him," he said quietly, once he'd pulled back enough to speak. "You could have told me you served with someone I trained," I said back. "Guess we're both men who don't talk much about the hard parts." He laughed, a wet, surprised laugh, and didn't let go for a while. Ashley came next, hugging me tightly, whispering, "I always knew there was more to you than you let on. I just didn't know it was times this." I told her it didn't change anything about who I was yesterday, and she said no. It just means everyone else finally has to catch up to who you always were. Diane approached eventually, because social obligation is a powerful force, even in humiliation. She said something about how she had no idea and hoped I understood it was all in good fun. I didn't argue with her. I didn't need to. Some corrections don't come from raised voices. They come from a room full of witnesses, recalculating in real time exactly who they'd been looking down on. In the weeks since, things have shifted in small, unspoken ways. Diane still isn't warm with me. Some people don't have that capacity, no matter what they learn. But the comments stopped. The introductions changed. I heard secondhand through Ashley that Diane told a friend at her book club I was actually quite accomplished in the military, as if this were new information she generously decided to believe rather than a truth she'd simply never bothered asking about. Patricia sent a card, an actual card, with a real apology written inside, not just a line about good fun. I appreciated the gesture, even if I suspected General Hale's 90-second toast had taught her more about manners than 4 years of my own quiet dignity ever managed to. Gerald, of all people, called me directly a week later and asked if I'd be willing to have lunch sometime. I feel like I never really got to know you, he said, which was as close to an admission as a man like Gerald was likely to make. We had lunch. It was fine. Not warm, exactly, but honest, which was more than I'd expected. Ashley told me later about a conversation she'd had with her mother the morning after the party. She hadn't planned on repeating it to me, but it slipped out over coffee one Sunday, and I think some part of her needed to say it out loud to someone. She'd confronted Diane directly, something Ashley almost never did, and asked her mother point blank why she'd spent 4 years treating me like an inconvenience. Diane's answer, according to Ashley, was quieter than either of them expected. I don't know, she'd said. I think I decided who he was the first time I met him based on his suit and his car, and I never once asked myself if I was wrong. Ashley said it was the closest to an honest thing she'd ever heard her mother say. It didn't fix everything between us, but I appreciated that Diane, in her own limited way, had at least looked honestly at the mirror once it was held up to her. Michael and Ashley are expecting their first child, now a boy, due in the spring. Michael asked me a few weeks ago if I'd be willing to tell his son someday about the years I spent training soldiers when he's old enough to understand it. I told him I would if it ever felt like the right thing to pass on. Some stories are worth handing down carefully, not all at once. The way Eleanor used to say, good bread needs time to rise before it's ready for the oven. I want him to know his grandfather is the reason a lot of soldiers came home to their own families, Michael said. Not because of the medal, because of what it says about who you are. I told him that was a kind thing to say, and that I hoped when the time came, I'd know how to tell it in a way that honored the men who didn't get to come home just as much as the ones who did. Michael and I talk more now, not about the war, that's still not a door either of us needs to open all the way, but about the years I drove trucks, the years he doesn't remember clearly because he was young, the sacrifices he's only now old enough to understand as sacrifices rather than just how things were growing up. I used to be embarrassed. You never talked about your service. He told me one night over coffee at my kitchen table, the same recliner with the Florida-shaped stain visible in the next room. I thought it meant it wasn't a big deal. Now, I think it meant the opposite. I told him the truth, that some men come home from certain places and either talk about it constantly, needing the world to understand what it cost them, or they go quiet because talking about it means reliving parts they've worked very hard to set down. I chose quiet, not because it was small, because it was heavy. And I didn't want my son to carry any of that weight secondhand the way I'd carried the names of soldiers who didn't come home. He understood. I think he'd always sort of understood underneath the questions he never quite asked. Robert General Hale insisted I call him Robert now, in private has called twice since the party, just to talk. The first time, he apologized for not recognizing my name sooner. I told him there was nothing to apologize for. 34 years and a common surname is a reasonable excuse. The second call, he simply wanted to tell me about his grandson, who'd just been born, and ask if I had any advice about being a good grandfather. I laughed and told him I was still figuring that part out myself. There's one more thing I did in the weeks after the party that I haven't told anyone about until now. I drove out to the cemetery where Danny Wexler is buried, a small veteran section on the edge of a town I'd only ever passed through before, about 4 hours from my house. I hadn't been in over a decade. I don't know exactly what pulled me there that particular week, except that hearing my own name spoken with that kind of weight in a country club ballroom had stirred something loose in me that needed somewhere quieter to settle. I stood at his headstone for a long while, Sergeant Daniel Wexler, 26 years old when he died, which still strikes me every time as impossibly young, younger than my own son is now. I told him out loud, feeling a little foolish and not particularly caring about the toast General Hale had given. I told him that the training mattered, that it had carried at least one man home to become a general who was now himself training the next generation of soldiers who might survive because of what got passed down. I told him I still had his mother's letter in my drawer and that I still thought about him more often than people probably assumed a man my age would still think about anyone. I don't know if that kind of talking to the dead does anything for the dead. I've come to believe it mostly does something for the living. Adi, this home. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in a long while, not because anything had changed about Danny's absence, which is permanent and unchangeable and always will be, but because I'd finally said out loud something I'd been carrying silently for over 30 years, that his life had mattered, that his training had mattered, that somebody besides his mother and me still remembered his name. I think that's part of what nobody tells you about growing old quietly, the way I have. You accumulate names. Some belong to the living, like Michael and Ashley, and now a grandson on the way. Some belong to men like Danny, who never got the chance to grow old at all. You carry all of them together, and every so often, life gives you a reason to set a few of them down gently in the light, instead of keeping every single one buried in a drawer. I'm 71 years old. I don't need a general's toast to know what my life has been worth. I knew that the day I held my son for the first time, and every day after, whether anyone in a country club ballroom recognized my name or not, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like something settling into place that night, like the universe finally squared a ledger that never needed squaring in my own mind, but apparently needed squaring in someone else's. Some nights since then, I've sat out on that same porch where I once sat with a grieving 11-year-old boy, and I've thought about Eleanor and about Danny Wexler's mother's letter in my drawer, and about a 23-year-old lieutenant on a tailgate under the stars who didn't know yet what kind of man he was going to become. I've thought about how strange it is that a life can move in complete silence for 34 years, unnoticed and unremarked upon, and then arrive all at once in a single toast in a ballroom full of people who never asked the right questions. I don't say any of this because I need anyone's validation now. I said everything I needed to say to myself a long time ago, usually alone, usually at night in the quiet after Eleanor passed, when I had to decide who I was going to be for a 9-year-old boy who needed a father more than he needed a hero. I made that decision then. Nothing that happened at that country club changed it. It only made other people finally see it. They called me a janitor, Turned out I built the road that led their general home. If you're the quiet one in your family, the one who gets looked past at the dinner table, the one whose whole life gets summarized in one dismissive sentence by someone who never bothered to ask a second question, I want you to hear this. Because I wish someone had told me this plainly when I was younger, and it might have mattered more. Your worth was never up for a vote. It never needed anyone's recognition to be real. The work you do quietly, the sacrifices nobody claps for, the porches you sit on with children who need you more than they need explanations, that is the actual substance of a life well lived. Whether or not a general ever stands up in a ballroom to say so. But every once in a while, if you're patient and if you keep doing the work, regardless of who's watching, the truth walks into the room on its own, wearing a general's stars, and reminds everyone else exactly who they were talking to all along.